The question never truly needed to be asked out loud, because the answer had already begun unfolding long before that office door ever clicked shut. It lived quietly in the spaces between routine, in the glances that lingered a fraction too long, in the silence that carried more weight than words ever could. For years everything had remained contained, carefully structured, defined by titles and expectations. Lily Chen had built her life around that structure, convincing herself that control meant safety, that professionalism meant distance, that boundaries could protect her from the things she refused to name. She believed she understood the rules of her world. 5 years working under Margaret Hail had taught her precision, discipline, and restraint. Every morning began with purpose, every task executed flawlessly, every interaction measured and contained. There was comfort in that predictability, even if it came at the cost of something softer, something human. Feelings had no place in a space built on power and hierarchy, and Lily had learned to bury them so deeply they almost felt non-existent. Almost. Margaret Hail existed at the center of that world like something untouchable, a force more than a person. At 47, she had shaped an empire from nothing, carving her name into an industry that respected brilliance but feared vulnerability. Everything about her reflected control. Her posture, her voice, the way she moved through rooms as if nothing could ever disrupt her rhythm. Even after 12-hour days, not a single strand of hair dared fall out of place. She was admired, respected, obeyed, but never truly known. That distance had always been necessary. It was the invisible line that kept everything functioning. Lily stayed on one side, Margaret on the other. Transparent walls, glass offices, open visibility, and yet an unspoken barrier stronger than anything physical. Nothing hidden, everything professional. Until something shifted. It began like any other late Friday evening, the kind that blurred into countless others before it. The elevator rose in silence, carrying Lily to the 42nd floor where the city glittered beyond the glass like a distant promise she had long stopped reaching for. Most people had already gone home, stepping back into lives filled with warmth and connection. That world felt far removed from hers, almost fictional. Work had become her constant, her identity, the thing that filled every empty space. Margaret was already at her desk, absorbed in numbers and contracts, her focus sharp enough to cut through anything that dared distract her. A simple nod acknowledged Lily's presence, nothing more, nothing less. It was always like that. Efficient, controlled, safe. Lily settled into her own space just outside the glass office, surrounded by documents that represented the vastness of Margaret's empire. Numbers and clauses replaced conversations, deadlines replaced emotions. It was easier that way. When her phone buzzed, it felt almost intrusive. A reminder of a life that existed beyond these walls. Sarah's voice broke through the monotony, warm and familiar, carrying concern that Lily had grown used to brushing aside. The conversation unfolded with an ease that didn't exist anywhere else in her life. There was laughter, soft protests, the gentle insistence that she was missing something bigger than deadlines and late nights. Sarah's words lingered longer than usual this time. They slipped past Lily's defenses, settling somewhere uncomfortable. The idea of being invisible, of giving everything to someone who never truly saw her, echoed louder than she wanted to admit. It wasn't entirely fair, and yet it wasn't entirely wrong either. Margaret had never been unkind. She had been professional, respectful, consistent. But warmth was absent, curiosity non-existent. 5 years, and not a single question about who Lily was beyond her role. Not a single moment that crossed into something personal. That was the way it had to be, and yet the doubt remained. After the call ended, the silence felt heavier. The reflection in her computer screen showed a version of herself she barely recognized. Tired. A person shaped entirely by routine. Somewhere along the way, the excitement had faded, replaced by something quieter, something emptier. Movement from inside the office drew her attention. Margaret stood by the window, her back straight but her shoulders carrying a tension that didn't belong to the woman Lily thought she knew. There was something different in the way she held herself, something less composed, almost fragile in a way that felt impossible. That image stayed with Lily as she gathered the contracts and stepped into the office. The shift became undeniable the moment Margaret turned around. There was something in her expression, something unfamiliar and unguarded. It wasn't authority or expectation. It was something searching, something that made Lily's breath catch without understanding why. Even the way Margaret spoke her name felt different, slower, deliberate, as if testing the weight of it. Then came the question about the phone call. It shouldn't have mattered. It had never mattered before. 5 years of complete disinterest in anything outside of work, and suddenly there was curiosity. Not sharp or accusatory, but focused in a way that felt almost personal. The observation about her smile landed deeper than expected. Margaret had noticed. Not the polite, practiced expressions Lily wore every day, but something real, something unguarded, something she had never allowed into this space before. The realization sent warmth rushing to her face, a mixture of embarrassment and something harder to define. The air shifted around them, charged with something unspoken. Margaret moved differently now, stepping away from the rigid structure she always maintained. Sitting on the edge of her desk instead of behind it, closing the distance that had always remained firmly in place. Every movement felt intentional, every glance carrying weight. For the first time, the invisible line between them blurred. The question that followed changed everything. It wasn't just about curiosity. It was about possibility. About breaking something that had been carefully preserved for years. Lily understood it instantly, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Understanding meant acknowledging something she had spent years denying. Margaret knew that too. The space between them grew smaller, filled with the quiet intensity of two people standing on the edge of something irreversible. The subtle scent of her perfume, the closeness that felt both natural and forbidden, the way her voice softened without losing its strength. Every detail sharpened, every sensation heightened. Then the sound of the lock. A simple click that echoed far louder than it should have. It wasn't just a door closing. It was the end of something familiar, the breaking of a boundary that had defined everything until now. The safety of distance disappeared in an instant, replaced by something unpredictable and raw. Lily stood frozen, the contracts in her hands suddenly meaningless. The structure she had relied on for years crumbled silently around her, leaving nothing but uncertainty in its wake. Margaret remained by the door for a moment, her hand still resting against it, as if grounding herself before turning back. The silence stretched, thick with everything neither of them had said. When she finally faced Lily again, the transformation was complete. The composed, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by something real, something vulnerable, something that had been hidden beneath years of control and expectation. It wasn't weakness. It was honesty, stripped of pretense, impossible to ignore. For the first time in 5 years, there were no walls left between them. Her composure fractured in a way that felt almost impossible, as if something long buried had finally forced its way to the surface. The control she wore so effortlessly slipped, exposing something unsteady beneath it, vulnerability tangled with confusion, and a deeper emotion that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. She moved away from the door slowly, her voice quieter than it had ever been. Stripped of authority and certainty, she spoke about control as if it were the foundation of everything she had ever built, something she understood better than anything else. Markets, people, negotiations, outcomes, every variable could be measured, predicted, mastered. That had always been her strength. That had always been enough. Now it wasn't. A hollow laugh escaped her, empty of any real amusement, and it only emphasized how unfamiliar this moment was for her. For someone who could calculate risk with precision, who could anticipate the movement of entire industries, there was something deeply unsettling about facing something she couldn't define, couldn't control, couldn't reduce to logic. The contract slipped from Lily's hands onto the nearest chair, forgotten instantly. Her fingers trembled, the steady professionalism she had relied on beginning to falter under the weight of something far more personal. Margaret began pacing, the elegance of her usual movements disrupted by a restless energy that didn't belong to her. Every step carried tension, every word measured as if she were trying to solve something unsolvable. For years, Lily had been a constant in her life, efficient, reliable, precise. Those qualities had once been enough to define everything. Now they felt incomplete. Something had changed and Margaret could no longer ignore it. She stopped abruptly, turning to face Lily with an intensity that felt almost overwhelming. Her words came slower, more deliberate, as if she were forcing herself to say them aloud, to acknowledge something she had been avoiding for far too long. There had been a shift, subtle at first but undeniable now. A tension that lingered longer than necessary. Moments that extended beyond their purpose. Anticipation that had nothing to do with work. She admitted to watching, to noticing, to looking forward to things that had nothing to do with schedules or agendas. The confession sounded unreal even to her, as if she couldn't quite believe it herself. The idea of it unsettled her, clashing against everything she had spent years building. The distance between them felt fragile now, like something that could collapse with the slightest movement. When Lily spoke her title, the response was immediate, almost instinctive. The formality no longer fit. It created space where there should be none, reinforced boundaries that were already beginning to dissolve. Margaret asked for something simpler, something stripped of hierarchy and distance. Her name, it carried a different weight in that moment, something more personal, more human. Not a title, not a position of power, but an identity she rarely allowed anyone to see. Hearing it even silently shifted something in Lily's perception. The woman standing in front of her was no longer just the untouchable CEO. She was something far more real, far more vulnerable. Margaret leaned against her desk, gripping its edge as if she needed something solid to anchor herself. Her explanation came in fragments, each piece revealing more than the last. The moment that had changed everything seemed so small, so insignificant on the surface. A phone call, a smile, and yet it had altered something fundamental. Seeing that unguarded expression, hearing the warmth in Lily's voice had created a contrast she couldn't ignore. It was like witnessing something vivid after years of muted existence. A realization that her own world had been stripped of something essential. Something she hadn't even realized she was missing. For the first time, she used Lily's name with intention, and the sound of it carried a weight that lingered between them. It wasn't just recognition. It was acknowledgement. She admitted her fear openly, something that felt even more significant than the words themselves. A life built on avoiding complications had left her unprepared for something unpredictable. Personal attachments had always been seen as liabilities, distractions that disrupted efficiency. They didn't fit into the structure she had spent her entire life perfecting. And yet, Lily didn't fit into that structure either. 5 years of quiet presence, of understanding without being told, of anticipating needs before they were spoken. It had started as convenience, as efficiency. Somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely, something essential. The realization unsettled everything. Lily felt the weight of it, the sense of standing at the edge of something irreversible. One wrong step could dismantle everything she had worked for, her career, her stability, the carefully maintained distance that had protected her for so long. The instinct to pull back, to restore order, surfaced immediately. Margaret rejected it just as quickly. Carefulness had defined her entire life, and she spoke of it with a quiet bitterness that revealed just how much it had cost her. Success had come easily to her in comparison, measurable and tangible. But it had left behind something empty, something she could no longer ignore. She moved closer, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to erase the comfort of distance. The space between them felt intentional now, charged with meaning. The mention of the phone call shifted the moment again. There had been awareness, more than Lily had realized. Words overheard, assumptions exposed. The idea that she had been invisible, that she had gone unnoticed, no longer held any truth. Margaret had seen everything, not in broad, general ways, but in details so specific they felt intimate. Small habits, quiet routines, things Lily had never thought anyone would pay attention to. The way she focused, the precision of her timing, the subtle rituals she carried into important days. Even the things she had never spoken aloud had been observed, remembered. It left Lily momentarily unsteady, confronted with the realization that she had never truly been unseen. Acknowledgement settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Margaret's certainty contrasted sharply with the doubts Lily had carried for so long. The question that followed shifted the focus again, turning the attention back onto Lily. Seeing went both ways, and it demanded honesty. What she saw was no longer just a title or a position. It was the person behind it. The discipline, the quiet kindness, the weight carried without complaint, strength that extended beyond business, beyond success. And beneath it all, something deeply human, something lonely. The admission changed the atmosphere instantly. Relief surfaced in Margaret's expression, tempered by something more fragile. Hope, perhaps, or fear of what came next. Recognition created a new kind of problem, one that couldn't be solved with logic or control. Feelings complicated everything. Margaret acknowledged it without hesitation, the lack of professionalism, the impossibility of fitting something like this into the structure of their world. The word itself felt inadequate for the weight it carried. Complicated barely scratched the surface. She stepped closer again, the smallest movement carrying the greatest impact. The question of what came next lingered between them, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Lily saw her clearly then, not as an authority figure, not as someone distant and untouchable, but as a woman standing in front of her with honesty she had never shown before. Someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross, who had admitted something that changed everything. Uncertainty remained, but so did something else. Margaret admitted she didn't have answers, only the certainty that silence was no longer an option. The locked door was no longer just a physical barrier. It was a refusal to continue pretending, a rejection of the distance that had defined them for so long. She spoke of exhaustion, not from work, but from restraint, from watching, waiting, holding back, from maintaining boundaries that no longer made sense. Something shifted inside Lily then, the fear giving way to something more fragile but stronger at the same time. Possibility. The desire to no longer remain unseen, to no longer exist only in the background of someone else's life, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Margaret's words settled deeply, more binding than any agreement, more powerful than anything written on paper. The truth that followed was quiet but steady. Lily had never been invisible. Margaret's denial of that idea felt absolute, leaving no space for doubt. The struggle had never been about noticing, but about understanding when and how that noticing had transformed into something more. Courage surfaced slowly, fragile but determined. The past offered a starting point, a memory that felt distant but suddenly relevant. That first meeting, shaped by intimidation and expectation, had carried something else beneath it. Not power, not success, loneliness. It had been there from the beginning, hidden behind reputation and control. And it had remained, visible in the smallest ways, in moments that passed too quickly for most people to notice. In smiles that never quite reached the eyes, in achievements that felt acknowledged but not truly felt. Margaret moved to the window again, but this time she wasn't alone. The distance between them had shifted permanently, replaced by something quieter, something shared. The city stretched out before them, bright and alive, yet distant in its own way. The truth emerged in that stillness. Work had always been a distraction, a way to fill space without addressing what lay beneath it. Success created noise, structure, purpose, but it didn't erase the silence waiting beyond it. Lily turned toward her, understanding settling into something deeper. The question didn't need to be asked aloud. The answer was already there, reflected in the way Margaret looked at her, in the vulnerability she no longer tried to hide. The fear wasn't about failure or loss of control. It was about significance. About realizing that someone mattered in a way that couldn't be measured or predicted. About feeling something that disrupted everything she thought she understood about herself. And that realization, more than anything else, was what unsettled her the most. She turned away from the window and faced Lily fully, no longer shielding herself behind distance or reflection. The city lights faded into the background as her voice carried something far more intimate, something stripped of the control she had relied on for most of her life. She spoke of independence as if it had once been her greatest achievement, a carefully constructed existence where needing no one had been the ultimate form of strength. Every decision, every success, every quiet night had been built on that principle. And then something had disrupted it. Lily's presence had not been loud or demanding. It had been steady, consistent, almost invisible in the way it blended seamlessly into Margaret's world. Efficiency had been the first thing she noticed, then reliability, then a quiet strength that never sought recognition. But beneath all of that, there had been something else, something far rarer than any professional skill. Kindness. It was spoken softly, but it carried weight. In Margaret's world, kindness was often transactional, a means to an end, something offered with expectation. What Lily gave had never come with conditions. There had never been a request for more, never an attempt to leverage proximity to power. It had simply existed, constant and unassuming. That absence of demand had made it impossible to ignore. Lily's response came gently, almost as if testing the space between them. There had been things she could have asked for over the years, things she had denied herself in favor of maintaining balance. The truth of what she wanted, however, had always been simpler than anything material or professional. Not access, not advantage, something more human. Margaret's name, it had remained just out of reach for years, hidden behind formality and hierarchy. Saying it now felt like crossing a boundary that had once seemed absolute. The shift was immediate, visible in the way Margaret's expression softened, in the quiet invitation that followed. The sound of her own name, spoken without title or distance, settled into the room with unexpected intimacy. She closed her eyes briefly, as if holding on to it, as if it carried something she hadn't realized she needed. When it was spoken again, stronger this time, something in her changed. The smallest smile appeared, subtle but undeniable. She admitted she had wondered what it would sound like, not in general, but in Lily's voice specifically. The answer had not been neutral or casual. It had felt like something grounding, something familiar in a way that defied explanation. Like coming home. The words landed with a quiet force that neither of them could ignore. For someone who had built her identity on control and distance, the admission carried a vulnerability that went far beyond anything she had said before. It was not calculated or measured, it was honest in a way that left no room for interpretation. Emotion surfaced before Lily could contain it, the weight of that confession breaking through carefully maintained composure. Tears came without warning, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming tenderness in the moment. It was unfamiliar, unexpected, and deeply affecting. Margaret noticed immediately. She stepped closer, concern replacing the uncertainty that had filled her earlier words. The reaction seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't anticipated the impact of what she had said. The idea that no one had ever spoken like that to Lily before lingered between them, carrying its own quiet significance. Her hand lifted instinctively, stopping just short of contact, as if she were still learning the boundaries of something new. The hesitation spoke volumes. Permission mattered here in a way it never had in any other part of her life. When it was given, her touch was careful, almost reverent. She brushed away a tear with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the authority she carried in every other aspect of her world. It was a touch without control, without expectation, guided only by instinct and something she didn't yet fully understand. Uncertainty returned, but this time it was different. She admitted openly that she didn't know how to navigate this space. Business relationships had always been structured, predictable, governed by clear expectations and outcomes. What existed between them now had none of that. There were no rules, no strategies, no guarantees, just feeling. The lack of structure unsettled her. Everything in her life had always followed a plan, a deliberate path designed to minimize risk and maximize success. Without that framework, the situation felt chaotic, undefined. Lily's response carried a quiet acceptance of that uncertainty. Not everything needed to be controlled or mapped out in advance. Some things simply existed, evolving on their own terms. The idea of chaos, even in small amounts, didn't feel threatening to her. It felt natural. Margaret reacted to that difference with a kind of disbelief, as if she were encountering an entirely foreign concept. The idea of acting without a plan, of making decisions based purely on impulse or emotion, clashed with everything she believed about how the world worked. Lily embodied that contrast completely. Stories of spontaneous decisions and unplanned moments painted a picture of someone who moved through life guided by instinct rather than calculation. Painting an apartment in a single weekend, driving long distances for no reason other than curiosity, changing pieces of herself in response to emotion. It was unpredictable, unstructured, and entirely real. Margaret absorbed it slowly, processing each detail as if translating a language she had never learned. What seemed reckless at first revealed something deeper upon closer examination. Courage. There was a kind of bravery in living without guarantees, in embracing uncertainty instead of avoiding it. It wasn't the same as the calculated risks she took in business. It was something more personal, more exposed. That same quality existed in the moment they were sharing. Margaret recognized it, even if it felt unfamiliar. What she was doing now, what she had allowed herself to admit, carried its own form of risk. It didn't feel controlled or strategic. It felt raw, unpredictable, reckless, perhaps. The distinction between recklessness and bravery blurred, settling somewhere in between. Sometimes they were indistinguishable, defined only by perspective and outcome. She moved back toward her desk, but the shift in dynamic remained. The physical space hadn't changed, but the roles within it had. The separation between employer and employee had softened, replaced by something more equal, more uncertain. She acknowledged the reality of what lay ahead with clarity. Exploring whatever existed between them would change everything. Their professional relationship, the way others perceived them, the stability they had both relied on, it would all become more complicated. There would be consequences. Lily understood that fully, more than Margaret seemed to expect. The risks had not gone unnoticed or unconsidered. They had been present for months, quietly shaping thoughts and decisions long before this moment had arrived. The revelation shifted the balance again. This had not been sudden or one-sided. What Margaret was only beginning to understand had already been growing, quietly and steadily, within Lily. The admission of love came without hesitation, anchored in specific memories that had never faded. Moments of kindness that had seemed small at the time had carried far more meaning than Margaret had realized. Action she had barely remembered had left lasting impressions, shaping something deeper than either of them had acknowledged. Margaret listened with a kind of wonder, as if seeing herself through a perspective she had never considered before. The idea that she had been observed, understood, even hoped for, created a new layer of awareness. Lily had not simply been watching, she had been waiting. Waiting for something that might never have happened, holding on to a possibility that had no guarantee of becoming real. The vulnerability in that was undeniable, matched only by the uncertainty of what came next. Fear and exhilaration existed side by side, neither one canceling out the other. Margaret stepped closer again, closing the space between them until it felt almost non-existent. The words that followed were softer now, less guarded, carrying a quiet certainty that had been missing before. Presence mattered. Being there, despite everything, despite the risks and complications, held its own significance. It was a choice, deliberate and unavoidably real. When her hand found Lily's, the contact felt different from anything before it. It wasn't accidental or tentative. It was intentional, her fingers intertwining with a quiet assurance that spoke louder than words. Warmth spread through the connection, grounding and undeniable. The contrast between them became visible in that simple gesture. Differences in status, in lifestyle, in everything they represented, existed clearly. And yet, in that moment, those differences felt secondary to something far more important. The request to stay carried no defined shape, no clear path forward. It wasn't a plan or a promise. It was simply a refusal to let the moment dissolve into silence, to let everything return to what it had been before. Lily understood the implication. Carefulness had defined her for years, protecting her from exactly this kind of vulnerability. Margaret saw that clearly, recognizing the instinct to retreat, to restore order, to avoid the uncertainty that came with hope. Fear existed, undeniable and deeply rooted. Not fear of Margaret, but of what she represented, of wanting something that might not be sustainable, of risking something stable for something unknown. The possibility of loss extended beyond professional consequences. It reached into something far more personal. Losing even the version of Margaret she had known before felt like too much. Margaret considered that quietly, her attention drawn to their joined hands as if searching for answers in something tangible. The question of outcome lingered, unresolved but unavoidable. There was no guarantee of success, no certainty that the risks would lead to something lasting or meaningful. The reality of their differences made the situation even more fragile, more complex. The world rarely offered easy endings for stories like theirs. And yet there was still a choice. Margaret's smile returned, softer now but real in a way it had never been before. The idea of creating something of their own, something not defined by expectation or precedent, carried a quiet kind of hope. It wasn't simple. Nothing about it could ever be simple. But complexity didn't make it impossible. It only made it real. The city lights reflected across her face, illuminating a vulnerability that had been hidden for years. The shift that had brought them here had not happened in a single moment. It had been building, layer by layer, unnoticed until it became impossible to ignore. Seeing Lily smile for someone else had been the breaking point, the moment when everything unspoken demanded acknowledgement. The realization had been immediate and undeniable. She wanted to be the reason for that smile. And beneath that moment, beneath the clarity of it, there was something deeper still. A quiet admission that this had not begun tonight. It had been growing quietly and steadily, long before either of them had found the courage to speak it aloud. The memory surfaced slowly, carried in the quiet space between them, as Margaret drew from something that had clearly stayed with her longer than it should have. 3 months earlier, when illness had forced Lily away from the office, the absence had not gone unnoticed. The first day had passed with routine adjustments, with calls and reassurances that work would continue from a distance. By the third day, something had shifted. The office had felt incomplete, not in terms of productivity or efficiency, but in a way that couldn't be explained through numbers or schedules. There had been a hollow space where Lily usually existed, and Margaret had felt it. The flowers had been sent without much thought at the time, a simple gesture that seemed appropriate. A brief message, nothing elaborate, nothing that crossed any lines. And yet, the memory of Lily returning lingered far more vividly. Pale, still recovering, insisting she was fine even when it was clear she wasn't. That quiet determination had been familiar, expected. What hadn't been expected was the moment that followed. A brief, instinctive embrace. So quick it almost didn't register at first. Gratitude expressed without calculation, without restraint, before awareness returned and distance was restored just as quickly. The memory returned now with clarity, carrying with it the same sharp edge of embarrassment Lily had felt in that moment. For Margaret, it had meant something entirely different. It had crossed a boundary, undeniable and clear, but instead of discomfort, it had left behind a sense of rightness she hadn't been able to explain. The absence of that moment afterward had lingered more than the act itself. She had thought about it repeatedly, about how natural it had felt, about how much she had wanted it to happen again. Not the action alone, but what it represented. A connection that existed beyond roles and expectations. The admission settled between them, shifting something deeper. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what had been quietly building beneath it. A desire not just for efficiency or reliability, but for something softer, something more human. To be someone Lily could turn to, not out of obligation but out of comfort. To matter in a way that extended beyond work. Lily's response carried a quiet certainty now, the hesitation that once defined her words beginning to fade. Margaret mattered, not just in the role she held, but in the person she was. The distinction felt important, necessary. The name came easier now, no longer foreign or forbidden. Margaret. It fit differently now, shaped by everything that had been revealed between them. There was recognition in that, but also understanding. Loneliness had been present all along, hidden behind success and control. It had taken time to see it clearly, to understand that what looked like strength was often just protection. A carefully maintained distance that kept everything intact, but kept everything out as well. Margaret absorbed that quietly, the truth of it settling in ways she hadn't expected. The question of protection shifted back, reflecting something equally true. Lily had not been untouched by fear. Guarded in her own way, protecting herself from hope, from expectation, from the possibility of wanting more than she could have. The depth of that feeling had never been fully spoken before. Now it was. It lived in small, seemingly insignificant details, in the way a smile could change the shape of an entire day, in the quiet attention given to things that extended far beyond obligation, in the choice to learn, to remember, to care in ways that weren't required. It had grown quietly, steadily, until it became something impossible to ignore, and it was frightening. Margaret stepped closer, drawn not by certainty, but by shared vulnerability. The closeness revealed details that had always been there but never fully seen. The subtle variations in her eyes, the intensity in her gaze, the unspoken understanding that neither of them stood alone in their fear anymore. There was comfort in that. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of someone willing to face it alongside her. The touch that followed was light, deliberate, her fingers brushing against Lily's cheek with a care that felt almost fragile. There was intention behind it now, not hesitation, but a quiet willingness to move forward despite uncertainty. Her desires unfolded slowly, not rushed or concealed, but offered with honesty. Simple things, ordinary in a different context, but meaningful here in a way that felt profound. Time spent outside the boundaries of work, conversations that extended beyond schedules and responsibilities. Understanding the pieces of Lily's life that had always existed just out of reach. There was curiosity there, but also something deeper, a desire to be included, to be the reason for that unguarded smile, the one that had sparked everything, to exist in that space, not as an observer, but as a part of it. The words carried weight, not because they promised certainty, but because they acknowledged risk. The possibility of failure was present, unavoidable. But so was the alternative, a future shaped by silence and unanswered questions. That possibility felt far heavier. Hope and fear coexisted in Margaret's expression, no longer hidden behind composure. The absence of her usual defenses revealed the person Lily had come to know in quiet moments, the one she had fallen for without realizing it. The answer came softly but with conviction, a willingness to try. The shift was immediate, visible in the way Margaret responded, in the way something bright and unguarded surfaced in her expression. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. The distance between who she had been and who she allowed herself to be in that moment felt smaller than it ever had before. One condition followed, simple but significant. Names mattered. The removal of formality, the rejection of titles, marked a new beginning. Lily was no longer defined by her role, just as Margaret was no longer confined to hers. The exchange felt symbolic, a quiet agreement to step into something more equal, more real. Their names settled into the space between them, no longer barriers, but connections. Time seemed to slow in the quiet that followed, the weight of everything that had changed settling around them. The office remained the same, the city still glowing beyond the glass, but nothing within it felt unchanged. Everything had shifted. The next steps were uncertain, undefined. There was no clear path forward, only the acknowledgement that things could not return to what they had been before. Time would be needed, space to process what had been set in motion. But even in that uncertainty, there was clarity. Tomorrow would not be the same. The difference would exist in every glance, every word, every moment that followed. It could not be undone. Margaret lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss against Lily's knuckles. The gesture was gentle, almost tentative, but filled with meaning. Gratitude, trust, something deeper that hadn't yet been given a name. It lingered even after she pulled away, visible in her eyes. Trust had replaced uncertainty, not completely but enough to matter. Lily's voice softened as she spoke again, carrying another truth that had been held back for years. The belief that this connection had existed only in her own mind, shaped by doubt and reinforced by distance. The idea that someone like Margaret could never feel the same had become a quiet certainty she had learned to live with. Saying it aloud stripped it of its power. Margaret's response came with a quiet intensity, her grip tightening slightly as she absorbed the words. The idea of difference, of not belonging, was something she rejected without hesitation. What she saw in Lily had never aligned with those doubts. It existed in the way she moved through the world, in the way she treated people, in the way she carried herself without ever diminishing others. Strength that didn't demand attention, kindness that didn't expect return, qualities that stood out in a world often defined by ambition and self-interest. There was beauty in that, undeniable and rare. The way Margaret described it carried a conviction that left no room for dismissal. What Lily saw as ordinary, she saw as extraordinary. What Lily questioned, she valued. The contrast between those perspectives shifted something fundamental. For the first time, Lily allowed herself to be seen through someone else's eyes. It was overwhelming, unfamiliar, and deeply affecting. The quiet that followed held everything they had yet to say, everything that had already been revealed. The city stretched out below them, unchanged and indifferent, while inside that office, something entirely new had taken shape. Breaths came a little faster, not from fear alone, but from the weight of possibility. Margaret's honesty continued, reaching into the uncertainties she hadn't yet voiced. The fear of not knowing how to meet expectations that extended beyond anything she had experienced before. Relationships required something different, something she had never needed to learn. The word itself felt unfamiliar, almost fragile, and yet the desire to understand it, to try, existed clearly. Lily met that uncertainty with something steady, something grounded in the same willingness to figure things out together. There was no guidebook for what they were stepping into, no clear example to follow. It would be complicated, unpredictable, but not impossible. Margaret's laughter broke through the tension, lighter than anything that had come before. It carried a sense of release, of stepping into something unknown without fully resisting it. Complications were inevitable. Boundaries would need to be drawn, roles carefully managed, discretion maintained. The practical realities of their situation remained impossible to ignore. Even in this moment, Margaret's instinct to plan and structure surfaced again, shaping the future before it had even begun. Lily recognized it immediately. The pattern hadn't disappeared, only softened. The need for control, for strategy still lingered, trying to define something that refused to be contained. And yet, for the first time, it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like something they would learn to navigate together. She studied me for a moment, then let out another soft laugh, lighter this time, as if something inside her had finally loosened. The tension in her shoulders eased just enough to reveal a different side of her, one that wasn't constantly calculating or controlling outcomes. She admitted how instinctively she had tried to structure everything, to approach this like a negotiation or a merger, something that could be mapped out and managed. Then she let that instinct go. Instead of planning every step, she chose something unfamiliar. She chose to simply try to move forward without knowing exactly where it would lead, to trust feeling over strategy. The admission unsettled her, and she didn't hide it. It was terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with business risks or financial stakes. This was personal, unguarded, impossible to predict. That fear didn't push her away. It pulled her closer. There was a quiet understanding that the things worth doing were often the ones that carried the most uncertainty, the ones that couldn't be controlled or contained. Margaret accepted that slowly, nodding as if committing herself to something she had never allowed before. No strategies, no carefully designed outcomes, no long-term projections, just two people moving forward, figuring things out one moment at a time, just us. The simplicity of it seemed to surprise her, and the small smile that followed carried something genuine, something unpracticed. Time slipped back into awareness when Lily glanced at the clock. The office had grown quieter, the building nearly empty around them, the world outside continuing without any knowledge of what had just changed inside those walls. The suggestion to leave felt natural, necessary even. They both needed space to process what had unfolded, to sit with the weight of it without the immediacy of each other's presence. Margaret agreed, but her hand remained intertwined with Lily's, as if letting go would make everything feel less real. She spoke Lily's name again, softer this time, almost thoughtful. The mention of morning routines shifted the moment in an unexpected way. Something as simple as bringing coffee, a habit repeated countless times, no longer felt ordinary. It carried a new meaning now, something layered with intention rather than obligation. The realization settled deeply. What had once been routine would now be choice. Margaret seemed to understand that instinctively. The idea of being cared for not out of duty, but because it was wanted, because it mattered, changed the meaning of something so small into something significant. It felt right to her. She acknowledged the shift between them without hesitation. Everything would be different now, not just in grand, obvious ways but in the quiet details, in the moments that had once passed without thought. The future stood uncertain in front of them, and neither of them claimed to be ready for it. Readiness didn't seem necessary anymore. Willingness was enough. Margaret walked Lily to the door, their hands still linked, carrying that connection with them, as if it were something fragile and important. When her fingers reached the lock, she paused, holding the moment just a little longer. There was an awareness in her expression, a recognition that stepping beyond that door meant stepping fully into something real, something that couldn't be undone or ignored. Lily met that moment with quiet certainty. Beneath everything Margaret represented, the success, the power, the control, there was simply a person standing there, vulnerable and hopeful in a way that felt honest and undeniable. That was enough. The lock turned, the sound echoing softly in the stillness of the office. It marked a shift, not just in space but in everything that followed. There was no hesitation left in Margaret when she acknowledged her certainty. The elevator ride down carried a different kind of silence. It wasn't the distance that had once defined their interactions. It was something fuller, something shared. Both of them were still absorbing what had changed, still adjusting to the reality of it. When the doors opened into the parking garage, the world felt larger again, colder somehow, but also clearer. Margaret stayed close, offering to walk alongside Lily without hesitation. It wasn't about necessity. It was about care. The walk across the empty concrete space echoed softly around them, their footsteps the only sound. When they reached the car, the moment shifted again, smaller now, quieter. Lily's voice carried a hint of shyness that hadn't been there before, as if everything between them had made even simple words feel different. Margaret responded just as gently. For a brief second, it seemed like something more might happen, like the space between them might close entirely. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to Lily's forehead. The gesture was tender, deliberate, lingering just long enough to leave an imprint that went far deeper than the touch itself. It carried warmth, reassurance, something steady. Lily watched her walk away, the contrast between them visible even in that simple movement. Margaret's car waited in its designated space, sleek and distant in a way that reflected the world she came from. And yet when she turned back, catching Lily's gaze, the smile she offered bridged that distance completely. The drive home unfolded in a quiet haze, the city lights reflecting against the windshield as thoughts replayed again and again. The memory of her voice, her touch, the way everything had shifted in a single evening. The message arrived unexpectedly, simple and direct, carrying the same sincerity she had shown in person. Gratitude, acknowledgement, something deeper hidden within the words. Seeing her name appear like that, without formality, without distance, made everything feel even more real. Tomorrow would not be the same. The realization settled gently, not with fear, but with anticipation. Walking into that office would mean stepping into two roles at once, both familiar and entirely new. For the first time in years, the thought of Monday morning didn't feel like routine. It felt like possibility. The next day arrived wrapped in gray skies and soft rain, the kind of morning that usually mirrored a quiet, predictable mood. This time it felt different. Sleep had been restless, thoughts circling back to every word, every glance, every moment that had reshaped everything. Standing in front of the closet became unexpectedly difficult. Something so simple now carried weight, as if every choice reflected a deeper question. Professionalism or something more personal. Safety or honesty. The message that came through broke that spiral instantly. A simple greeting, her name written with intention, a small adjustment to the morning schedule. Nothing dramatic, and yet everything about it felt different. There was a softness to it, an awareness that hadn't existed before. The choice became clear. The pink blouse felt like a step forward, a quiet acknowledgement of something new. The elevator ride carried a nervous energy that refused to settle, the familiar routine layered with something entirely unfamiliar. Coffee in hand, everything outwardly remained the same. Inside, nothing was. The office greeted her with silence, the early hour leaving the space still and undisturbed. Through the glass, Margaret was already there, focused as always, a silhouette framed by morning light. For a moment Lily simply watched, taking in details she had always noticed but never allowed herself to fully appreciate. Now she could. Margaret looked up, catching her in that quiet observation. Instead of the expected nod, she smiled. Not the polite, measured expression Lily had grown used to, but something warmer, something real. It changed everything. The knock on the door felt softer than usual, almost unnecessary. The invitation to enter carried a tone that felt different, more personal. Even the greeting held a new kind of weight, her name spoken in a way that lingered. The question about the weekend, simple as it was, marked a shift that couldn't be ignored. It was small, almost ordinary, but it had never existed between them before. It opened a space that had always been closed. Lily answered honestly, setting the coffee down as her thoughts returned to the night that had changed everything. The invitation to sit, not across the desk but closer, erased another layer of distance. Proximity carried its own awareness now, every detail sharper, every moment more present. Everything felt different. Margaret admitted her own uncertainty, the quiet fear that the weekend might have changed things. That reality might have erased what had felt so certain in that moment. The reassurance came easily, grounded in something stronger than hesitation. If anything, the certainty had only grown. Even the smallest details carried meaning now. A simple choice of clothing, something that would have gone unnoticed before, drew attention in a way that felt intimate. The acknowledgement in Margaret's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. It mattered. The realization that Lily was no longer dressing solely for her role settled into something deeper. The line between professional and personal had blurred, creating something new that neither of them fully understood yet. Margaret gave voice to it in the simplest way. The shift wasn't one-sided. Feelings had been there longer than either of them had admitted, growing quietly until they could no longer be ignored. Saying it out loud gave it shape, made it real in a way that changed everything. The space between them held that truth, fragile and undeniable. Neither of them knew exactly how to navigate it yet, how to balance what they had been with what they were becoming. The boundaries that had once felt so clear now seemed uncertain, shifting with every word, every glance. Desire to remain professional existed alongside something far more personal. Margaret voiced it carefully, acknowledging the tension between responsibility and feeling. The instinct to maintain structure clashed with the impulse to simply exist in the moment, to speak honestly without filtering it through expectation. And beneath it all, something lighter flickered. A quiet, growing sense that this, whatever it was, might be worth figuring out. Her laughter softened, losing that sharp edge of control she had carried for years, and something warmer took its place. She admitted she had been treating everything like a negotiation, like a merger that needed forecasting and contingency plans, and then let that instinct go with visible effort. The idea of simply trying, of stepping forward without guarantees, unsettled her, yet she held on to it anyway, as if it were something fragile and necessary. She accepted that there would be no structured roadmap, no carefully drafted outcome, just two people learning each other in real time. The uncertainty remained, but it no longer felt like something to avoid. It felt like something worth risking. The office had grown quiet around them, the kind of silence that settles after long hours when the world outside continues without you. Time had slipped past unnoticed, and the realization that it was already late pressed gently against the moment. Neither of them moved to let go. The connection between them, once unthinkable, now felt like the only solid thing in the room. She spoke about the morning ahead, about how even the smallest routines would no longer be simple. A cup of coffee would carry meaning now, intention instead of obligation. Familiar gestures would shift, becoming something personal, something chosen rather than assigned. That change landed deeply, reshaping years of habit in an instant. It was no longer about roles or expectations. It was about care. They walked toward the door together, hands still linked. The distance between them no longer defined by hierarchy but by hesitation and anticipation. The lock on the door became a quiet symbol of everything that had happened inside that room. Once it opened, there would be no returning to what had been. The decision to step forward carried weight, but neither of them pulled back. The hallway beyond felt different, as if the world had subtly rearranged itself. The elevator ride down unfolded in silence, yet it was no longer empty. It held everything they had said, everything they had risked, and everything they still did not understand. Their reflections in the mirrored walls stood side by side, no longer separate stories but something newly intertwined. In the parking garage, the air was cool and still, their footsteps echoing in the open space. She insisted on walking beside her, not out of obligation but out of something simpler and more human. The contrast between their worlds lingered quietly in the background, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a detail, something that existed but did not define them. When they stopped beside the car, the moment stretched again, fragile and uncertain. The goodbye carried more weight than it ever had before. A soft kiss pressed to her forehead replaced words, gentle and careful, as if both of them understood how easily this could break if rushed. The distance between them returned only in steps, not in feeling. Driving home, the city lights blurred into something dreamlike. the night holding on to the memory of everything that had changed. A message arrived, simple and sincere, carrying gratitude and something deeper beneath it. It was saved, held onto, like proof that the moment had been real. Morning arrived with quiet gray skies, but everything felt different. Sleep had been restless, filled with echoes of voices, touches, and confessions that refused to settle. Standing in front of the closet became an unexpected challenge, as if even the smallest choice carried meaning now. The decision between safe and something more became symbolic of everything that had shifted. A message in the early hours carried warmth that had never existed before in their exchanges. The tone was softer, personal, unguarded. It changed the rhythm of the day before it had even begun. The choice that followed felt instinctive rather than calculated. Walking into the office felt like stepping into a familiar place that no longer held the same rules. The routine remained intact on the surface, but beneath it was something entirely new. Seeing her across the room, framed by glass and morning light, no longer felt like looking at someone distant and untouchable. It felt like seeing someone known. The smile that followed replaced years of formal acknowledgement. It held warmth, recognition, and something quietly shared. The conversation that morning carried a different tone, simple questions becoming meaningful because they had never existed before. There was an awareness now, a closeness that made even silence feel full. They spoke carefully about boundaries, about maintaining the structure of their professional lives while allowing something else to exist outside of it. It was a balance neither of them had practiced before, yet both understood its necessity. Work remained work, steady and unchanged on the surface, while everything beyond it waited to be discovered. Moments of quiet honesty slipped through when the world allowed it. Small confessions replaced rehearsed interactions. Missing someone became something that could be said out loud. The unfamiliar territory of wanting, of anticipating, began to take shape in subtle ways. Time moved forward, and with it came a growing ease between them. The discovery of each other unfolded in small details, in habits and gestures that had always been there but never acknowledged. The distance that once defined them dissolved into something softer, something real. Evenings became something to look forward to, the office transforming from a place of structure into a space where they could simply exist without pretense. Music filled the silence, conversation replaced routine, and the boundaries between who they were and who they had been began to blur. The realization came quietly that something had been missing in the way they had begun. They had found each other in a place built for work, not for connection. The need to step outside of that space, to create something separate from it, became clear. An invitation followed, simple but significant. Leaving the office together, not as employer and employee but as two people choosing to be somewhere else, felt like crossing another invisible line. The desire to share time without the weight of roles or expectations carried a different kind of importance. The honesty that followed deepened everything. Feelings were no longer implied or hidden behind careful language. They were spoken plainly, with all the fear and vulnerability that came with them. Love, once unacknowledged, was now undeniable, and with it came the need for reassurance, for truth without obligation. The response was not hesitation but clarity. What had been building quietly for years found its voice in simple, undeniable words. It was not about titles, positions, or expectations. It was about seeing and being seen, about choosing someone not because of circumstance but because of something deeper and unexplainable. In that moment, everything aligned. The uncertainty remained, the complications still existed, but they no longer overshadowed what mattered. What stood between them was real, undeniable, and worth whatever came next. The distance closed without hesitation, hands finding each other again, grounding them in something steady. The world outside continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had taken place within those walls. But for them, everything had changed, and there was no desire to return to what had been. She deserved to be loved without conditions, without expectations tied to success or status, loved simply for who she was beneath everything she had built. The words came quietly, but they carried a weight that settled deep between them. Love, once unspoken and carefully buried, now existed openly, undeniable and real. Their voices softened as they spoke it aloud, a mutual confession that erased years of distance in a single breath. The space between them closed slowly, deliberately, leaving room for hesitation that never came. When their lips met, it was gentle, unhurried, filled with a tenderness that neither of them had ever allowed themselves to feel before. The moment lingered, tasting of quiet hope and something new unfolding. When they pulled apart, the air felt different, charged with everything that had just begun. Plans that once would have been approached with precision now carried a sense of warmth instead. A simple dinner reservation became a symbol of intention, of wanting something beyond the walls that had contained them for so long. There was a lightness in the exchange, a growing ease as they learned how to exist in this new space together, unpracticed but willing. Time moved forward, carrying them beyond that night into something steadier. Months later, the world they had cautiously stepped into had taken shape in ways neither of them could have predicted. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now held life, warmth, and the quiet rhythm of two people building something real together. Mornings became soft and unhurried, filled with small rituals that meant more than grand gestures ever could. The sound of coffee brewing, the quiet presence of another person in the room, the comfort of knowing that someone was there not out of obligation, but by choice. She moved through the space differently now, no longer guarded, no longer carrying everything alone. The transition that brought them here had not been simple. It had required letting go of old roles, stepping away from what was familiar, and facing the uncertainty that came with choosing something personal over something safe. There had been whispers, adjustments, moments of doubt, but none of it outweighed what they had found in each other. What remained was something steady and deeply felt. The absence of pretense made everything clearer. There was no need to hide affection behind professionalism, no need to measure words or actions. What they shared existed openly, woven into the smallest parts of their daily lives. Love revealed itself in quiet ways. In the way coffee was made exactly right without being asked. In the way space was shared without hesitation. In the way one learned the rhythms of the other, understanding when to speak and when to simply be present. It existed in the ordinary, in the moments that might have once gone unnoticed but now carried meaning. They learned each other slowly, discovering details that had nothing to do with work or expectation. Laughter came more easily. Vulnerability no longer felt like something to avoid. The walls that had once defined them became irrelevant, replaced by something softer and more human. A small gesture, wrapped simply, carried a significance far beyond its appearance. The weight of it rested not in what it was, but in what it represented. An invitation, not just into a space, but into a life. The offer was made carefully, with hope balanced by the fear of asking for too much. The answer came without hesitation, shaped by everything they had already built together. The idea of home shifted in that moment, no longer tied to a place, but to a feeling. Safety, warmth, belonging, all of it found in the presence of one another. Joy followed naturally, unrestrained and genuine. It existed in laughter, in movement, in the simple disbelief that something so right could exist after so many years of distance. The future, once something to control and predict, became something to share. They stood together in a space that now belonged to both of them, watching the light change, feeling the quiet certainty of what they had chosen. The past remained a part of them, but it no longer defined what came next. Love continued to show itself in countless ways, not through grand declarations, but through consistency, through presence, through the willingness to stay. It lived in shared meals, in conversations that stretched into the night, in the quiet understanding that neither of them had to face the world alone anymore. The idea of forever no longer felt abstract or distant. It existed in the everyday, in the decision to remain, to choose each other again and again without hesitation. What had begun with uncertainty had become something steady, something real. Morning light filled the room, dissolving the last traces of fog and revealing a day full of quiet promise. The world outside carried on as it always had, but inside everything felt different. What they had built was not perfect or simple, but it was theirs. And in that shared stillness, with the warmth of the moment settling around them, it became clear that sometimes the most meaningful beginnings are not loud or dramatic. They are found in small decisions, in quiet courage, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier.